Hello and welcome to this week's Civic Conversations Summer Series special. My name is Rachel Davison Humphries, and this conversation is helping you as educators talk about the difficult issues that you have to engage with in your classroom. Last week, we had our discussion with Dr. Anika Prather about race in the history classroom, and today I am so excited to be with Dr. Tim Hall. Hi, Dr. Hall. So Dr. Tim Hall is the 9 to 12 Social Studies Learning Guide with Vance Virtual Village Academy in North Carolina. He's a senior fellow at the Religious Freedom Institute and founder of the blog Religion Matters. This is his jam. He's been the author of several books, supplements, curriculum, standards, history textbooks, including The Complete Idiot's Guide to World History and The Complete Idiot's Guide to the Middle Ages. He's taught AP World, AP European, AP Psych, AP US, and just about every social studies Swiss Army knife course under the sun. And he is the he's had research fellowships at Oxford and the Kierkegaard Library at St. Olaf's College in Minnesota. And most recently, he's participated in the Harvard Divinity School Religion and Public Life Religious Liberty Summer Institute for Educators. So Dr. Hall advocates for religious liberty and global competence in the classroom, developed through he's also developed professional experiences at Asia Society, World Savvy, HTSE, the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and he also has a ton of resources at his blog, Religion Matters. So without further ado, hi, Dr. Hall, how are you?
I'm doing great, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I actually, after you said all that, I don't really have to do much of anything at this point. So you've answered all the questions for me and taken care of it all. So I'm very excited to be here to talk about religious literacy. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, so again, the reason that we're having these conversations is that we're really trying to help educators have the difficult conversations. And we kind of are thinking of these as like the third rails, right? The things you don't talk about at the dinner table, but you have to talk about in the history classroom: race, religion, and politics. And so for so many educators, like race, religion is one of those topics that is just hard to frame for students in the classroom. It's a hard conversation to bring up because it's deeply held values and deeply held positions that the students have and that the educators have. And so I wanted to start us off by asking you to tell us a little bit about your own educational journey. What's your background? And then at the end, if you could go into how you went from classroom educator, because you've been an educator and administrator for many, many years now, into becoming one of the premier voices for discussing religion in the classroom.
Well, that's a great opening question. So I've been in education, I'll just say 20 years plus. I won't put any more detail to that, but 20 plus years in education. I got my Bachelor of Arts in History at Elon University. And then I went on and got my Master's of Arts in History at East Carolina University. And my MA thesis was on Sutton Hoo and the question of Germanic sacral kingship. Very interesting stuff to me, probably very boring and dry as dirt to other people, but it was great stuff for me. I really loved that. And if you're interested in Sutton Hoo, by the way, there was a movie just released a couple months ago called The Dig, which is about the dig at Sutton Hoo. So that was a great experience for me.
The movie The Dig was great. If you haven't watched it yet, it's a really beautiful film about.
It is. It is. And I know the history of Sutton Hoo so well. So it was like coming to life for me finally, 20 years later. So and then, after my MA, I went on to National Endowment of Humanities program on principle of separation of church and state. Did 2 teacher studentships at Pembroke College, Oxford University. And then finally, while I was still teaching, I went on and got my PhD in interdisciplinary studies with a focus on education and philosophy. And my dissertation was really focused on the philosophy of Soren Kierkegaard and is upbuilding discourse for education. And so that's why I ended up going to St. Olaf College, because they had the Kierkegaard library there, and that's where I went to do my research. So, and during that time, I was lucky enough to be asked to write the Complete Idiot's Guide to World History, first and second edition. And then I asked to see if I could write the Complete Idiot's Guide to the Middle Ages. And Penguin accepted that, and lo and behold, I had that book out as well. The world history book sold very well. The Middle Ages, not quite as well as I hoped, but oh well. I mean, nobody has the passion for the Middle Ages like I did, I guess. So, but my pitch was that there were no books out there about the Middle Ages that people would want to read. I thought I would provide that, but I guess that just didn't happen for me.
You were just ahead of your time. That's it. I mean, we're not really understanding the importance of the pontiffs and like all of that interconnection yet. We'll get there.
They should, too bad the movie The Dig didn't come out earlier, and my book would have been much more successful, because people have been like, oh, the Middle Ages, that's great stuff. But anyways, so that's my educational track. All that time I've been teaching and doing administrative work as well, and curriculum instruction, and doing a variety of other projects on the side with a variety of people. So I really enjoyed that portion. And I guess to answer the second part of your question, and you said something about becoming one of the premier voices about discussing religion in the classroom. I mean, to be honest with you, Rachel, here, I don't really consider myself a premier voice. I mean, I think that distinction goes to others like, I think about Chris Murray, Greg Soden, Kate Souls, a variety of other people, not me. But I do feel passionate enough about religious literacy to create a website and a blog and to push out that message to K-12 educators. So I just want to be clear. I don't consider myself a premier voice, but thank you. That's a great compliment, though. So.
Yeah, and well, so I consider you a premier voice because like within my own network, within my own circles, you have such a strong advocacy for these kinds of discussions. So one of the things tell me a little bit about your own experience discussing religious liberty in the classroom. How did this become, or religious literacy, how did this become a passion?
That's even a better question. It's funny, it's the smallest little things that influence you. So when I was working on my MA thesis, the on Sutton Hoo, again, Anglo-Saxon burial rites, very important stuff to me, of course, but not to other people. But anyways, when I was working on that, looking at the site, the archaeological site Sutton Hoo, the major archaeologist and interpreter of that site, Martin Carver, basically said, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing, he said, these burial mounds, all 18 of them, they're really just a demonstration of power. That's it. The reason why they created these mounds was just a demonstration of power. Now, that being said, I had, been studying the Middle Ages, read a ton of books at that point under my mentor, Dr. Michael Enright. And at that point, I felt like, hey, he's really being short-sighted here and not recognizing the religious influence that the Middle Ages had, especially the early Middle Ages, but even in the Middle or the late Middle Ages. I mean, definitely in Anglo-Saxon culture at that time, you have a very strong influence of Christianity and paganism, And for him to say, this is just a demonstration of power. This is why they buried these ships here. They want to demonstrate their power. To me, it just seemed just a little glib, so to speak. And so, but I couldn't do anything with it. So I, stuck a pin in it and said, I'll remember that. And so when I moved on with the NEH program with Principle of Separation of Church and State, and with my world history book and the book on the Middle Ages, and some more reading by Christopher Dawson, I just started to see, especially with Christopher Dawson, who's a who's a very famous historian in the early 20th century, I started to see the importance of religion on cultures, that you couldn't separate culture and religion. And when I started thinking about that, and then I thought about in relation to the classroom, and I started looking at the resources that I had around me about teaching about religion in the classroom, I said, wait a minute, it seems to me that the perspectives that I have here are really kind of marginalizing religion to a very small spot in culture, and rather recognizing the fullness of religion in cultures. And so that was a question that bothered me. And of course, then I moved on with my PhD work, and you might know this, Rachel, because apparently you know St. Olaf and know where that is. Soren Kierkegaard was a Christian philosopher. And so, with me bringing him into education, non-cognitive education especially, I had to do some work and really kind of convincing people that this Christian philosopher and the sources that I'm using, his 18 upbuilding discourses, which are 18 Christian sermons, are important for education, non-cognitive education. And for people to, for my dissertation committee to take that, took some effort on my part and some writing and some reading. And that's why I came across Warren Nord and some of his books from UNC Chapel Hill about, religion and the importance of religious literacy and our lack in public education of really addressing this because of our fear of addressing this. And so that's what really kind of, so it was a long, to be honest, I kind of rambled on there. It was a long process to get to that, but all the while it started with my MA thesis, me sticking a pin in it and saying, hey, I think his interpretation is a little short-sighted. I think it's more than just power. I think there's more to it here. I think there's a religious influence on culture that we need to understand as people. And that's where that comes from. And so the blog and the website, that all came out from all of that.
That all that flowered from that moment. So we have so many participants in the session right now. I want to remind you that we do have a Q&A box. If you have any questions for Dr. Hall, please drop them in the Q&A, and we'll start cataloging all these names that he's dropping. Would you, Dr. Hall, if people wanted to learn more about kind of your influences, can you say those names again? Who were they?
Yeah, so if you're looking at Sutton Hoo, and Martin Carver is the archaeologist who was the lead archaeologist. He's retired now, but he was the lead in all of that. At the College of William Mary, I worked with Dr. Harris, James Harris, and he produced a book on the principle of separation of church and state, which I reviewed on one of my blogs at one time. And then the historian I mentioned earlier, the 20th century historian, was Christopher Dawson, who really said that, you can't separate religion and culture. Without religion, there is no culture. And so he was big on that point. He is mostly a European historian, but he applied that to world history as well.
Thank you. Yeah, we had some questions in the chat, just like, who was that that he mentioned? So we'll make sure. I see my colleague Chris is sending those through, so we have those nice and cataloged for you all. Well, that is a fascinating history and moves us into the present moment, which is this question about discussing religion in the classroom. So you helped us at the Bill of Rights Institute write our religious liberty curriculum. One of the beautiful things that I saw in that curriculum was a kind of teasing out of the difference between toleration and liberty, and kind of that kind of work. But what was also so important in that text was the use of primary sources. Can you talk a little bit about the use of primary sources? So BRI uses tons of primary sources in all of our resources, but the use of primary sources when talking about religion in the classroom.
Yeah, I definitely can. So typically, and this is again, when I first started teaching, I did not see anything wrong with what was in, say, a world history textbook. And typically in a world history textbook, you have you have the 6 major religions, maybe 8, depending on which textbook, and they put those religions off to the side somewhere, whether they create a a unit by itself, or at the front or the back of the book, or they do a section just about Islam, or whatever, however they do it. What it is it's what we call the world religions model, which is, that model is really static. It really demonstrates a very static notion of religion. And that static notion of religion, it really doesn't give our students a real sense of the importance of religion and culture. And so what I advocate for is what we call the lived religions model. And lived religion is understanding religion as is lived on a daily basis, encountered, understood, interpreted, and practiced on a daily basis, and that's very different than what you get in the textbook, which again is very static, and you have a few pictures of this, a church or something like that, and it's very static. So what we want to do is get to that lived religion model, and that gives students a better understanding of religion in the world today. And so primary sources do a great job of teasing out that lived religion model. And I'll explain a little bit more, a little deeper on why they provide that model, or help with that model. So and I'm not making all this up, so just make sure all the viewers know this is all based on the guidelines for teaching about religion in K-12 public schools in the United States, and that's published by the American Academy of Religion, which is really the world's largest association of religious studies scholars, 8,000 members. So I'm basing a lot of the 6-point framework that I'm going to provide the viewers here on what they have put together. Okay, and so for the first 3 points, I will say this. First of all, you need to, with those primary sources, and primary sources do a great job of just teasing that out. Students need to understand that religions are internally diverse. You cannot essentialize religions. You can't say Islam is this, Christianity is this, Catholicism is this. You cannot do that. Inside each religious tradition, you have internal diversity. I mean, and that's what primary sources can tease out. The other thing that primary sources can tease out is that religions and all religious traditions change over time. If you compare Islam to the Islam of the 700s, you're going to see a very different Islam. Okay, and same with Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism. All religious traditions change over time. And the last point that I'll make from the guidelines from the AAR is that all religions are embedded in cultures. And when I mean embedded, they give and take from the culture around them. They're not in isolation. And so when you're looking at a typical world history book, what you're seeing is a religion in isolation, or a religion in static historical mode. You're not seeing a lived religion, a religion that is very different in the world today. And I bring up Islam because Islam is the second largest religion in the world, and also very diverse. And then you compare Islam, say, in Saudi Arabia to Islam in Indonesia, and you have 2 very distinct versions of Islam, and that just kind of goes to that point. And those primary sources really tease that out, and I'll stop there before I give the last 3 points, if there's any questions about those first 3.
Well, I think Adam in the chat mentioned that it can be controversial because of ignorance about the belief systems of others, that often students come with a lot of biases
Mhm.
into the conversation. So what are some strategies that you've used to kind of start the conversation so that those biases don't dominate?
Well, I think, again, going back to those primary sources, I think that's where you, again, if you just read it in the world history textbook, Christianity is this, Hinduism is this, and Islam is this, and it's very static, and you can essentialize and generalize it very easily. But if you start to crack open those primary sources and look at different ways in which people, say in Islam, view the Quran, I mean, that really opens up their minds and really breaks down those generalizations. The point of this approach, really, which is really a cultural studies approach to looking at religion, is to really break down those generalizations to prevent discrimination of other religious identities. And so, yeah, I think going back to the primary sources, because I think that's where you can really crack open that nut there, is being able to show students, oh, wow, they're reading the Quran this way here, but they're reading it this way here, and they're saying this way, this interpretation over here. Wow, not every Muslim is the same, and same with Christians. I mean, let's take a look at take a look at Christianity. You have Protestants and Christian Catholics, but then Protestants have a variety of different interpretations of theology and doctrine, and really cracking open those primary sources to reveal that really prevents you from essentializing any of these religious traditions, which again prevents discrimination, and prejudice in the world, which I think is good. That's one of the goals of education, civic education, for sure.
Especially, and Dale actually mentions this as well, that not only do the textbooks make religion very static, but students themselves perceive their own religions as static because they only have their own lived religion, which
Yeah.
may be very different. Our high school students have about 6 years of memory, right? Like anything before 6 years ago is history, and not part of their experience. So I really appreciated that comment by Dale that students see their own religion as static. So
Yeah.
we can help them explore the history of whatever their own faith tradition is, to help, again, create a fullness of their own experience.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, if you want to take a look at US history in particular, you could take a look at Protestant perspectives of slavery prior to the Civil War and responses to slavery, because there were different responses for different sets of Protestant groups, from Quakers to Methodists, to Baptists, and how they either accepted slavery or did not accept slavery, and that's important, how the church, the Protestant churches at the time before the Civil War, some of them split over those differences, and again, that goes down to, looking at the primary sources on that. Let me add the last 3 points, which I call not just me, but we call the 3 B's. There's 3 other points that primary sources can really pull out in what we're doing with religion, and that is, first of all, the beliefs. So when you're looking at primary sources, you get really a better understanding of beliefs. That's from theology and doctrine on one side of the spectrum to value and ethics on the other side of the spectrum. It also allows students to understand behaviors, and which is in the textbook. You can see holy rites and rituals. They're very static. But then you see that break down that spectrum to habits and practices. What does that look like on a daily basis? And then finally, you can look at belonging through those primary sources, to these large transnational, transhistorical institutions, like the Catholic Church, to that spectrum to the local church, and how that may be different in comparison to your prayer groups and informal groups. And so primary sources really provide that opportunity to break open those type of conversations and understand those 6 points about religion, so you have that lived religious model rather than that world religion model view.
And we've actually linked to the document you're referring to, the Teaching About Religion in K-12 Public Schools in the US document in the chat. So scroll through, we've linked it a couple of times and you can find it right there. We have a couple of questions coming in, and I wanted to see if are you ready to go to some Q&A?
Well, so before we do, can I just, I want to talk to, just answer one question, which may actually be up in the Q&A, which is, I'm sure somebody's saying to himself, well, it's important to Dr. Hall there, but why should it be really important to me? You know,
well,
as
that's
a teacher,
literally one of the questions is, I don't have time for this.
Yeah, and what, who, as a friend would always tell me, you know, for the classroom, you have to understand why somebody should care. And so why should we care? Why is this important? Other than, you know, Dr. Hall is up here explaining this is important. Well, let me give you, first of all, 3 arguments for the importance of religious literacy. And these come from Diane Moore of the Harvard Divinity School, well-known advocate of religious literacy. Stephen Prothero of Boston University, another well-known advocate for religious literacy. And then Warren Nord of UNC Chapel Hill, he's passed away, but also an advocate, and Charles Haynes of the Religious Freedom Center. So these first 3 arguments really come from them. They're not mine. So, you know, I'm just kind of relaying these arguments. The first one would be a civic argument. And I think, Rachel, you would probably like this one, is, you know, schools must have a common ground, and we need to be able to listen and respect each other on really deeply held beliefs and understandings in the classroom, you know, and what better place than in the classroom to learn how to listen and respect each other than in schools and in the classroom with the teacher helping, you know, that process. And a lot of that comes, if you read, of course, the Bill of Rights Institute, you know, signed off on the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap. And that's part of that, you know, we need that civic understanding, that civic literacy. So that's one good reason. The second good reason is constitutional, which is, and you might appreciate this one as well. I mean, schools should remain neutral. We need to be religiously neutral, neutral among religions, and neutral between religion and non-religion. So we have to maintain our neutrality, and in order to do that, we have to teach the non-religious perspective and the religious perspective at the same time. And then the final one, and this is one which I really appreciate as well, but I have one that's even better, is the liberal education argument, which is, you know, students should be learning about religion to gain a deeper awareness of themselves and other people around them. And so, you know, you want to, if we're basing our idea of education on a liberal education, this is important. So those are the 3.
I love all 3 of those. So the civic argument, the constitutional argument, and the liberal arts. As a proud graduate of St. John's College Great Books program, the liberal arts argument also appeals to me. I saw there's someone from Annapolis in the chat, so you have a Johnny on the channel. So I think that those 3 arguments are really powerful for why it's important to have these conversations. Like you said, like we mentioned, and like we hear from a lot of educators so often, you know, it's a convenience that you don't have much time to get into these because they can be so contentious. So I'm wondering if we could go to the chat and have some of these questions and discuss some of these questions. Real quickly, one of the questions is, if we're using primary sources, there's a lot of bias built into the primary sources. Someone mentioned that it was the literate who were recording, and so we don't really know what the kind of masses religious like fervor was. That was a question. Or how we have diversity of opinion if we're using the primary sources which have a single narrow view. So can we speak to kind of how do we approach the primary sources within religion, and how do we interpret those kind of biases that are built in when discussing religion?
I think that's an excellent question. I think, you know, much like with any primary source document, you need your students to start analyzing, the point of view, the intent, the audience of that document, and all of that's part of that. And then also the context of that document as well. And if your students are doing that, then that allows them to understand that, hey, there's a lot of interpretation, even with my overlay of interpretation on top of this document as well. And so again, going back to the initial point I was trying to make, is then you can't really essentialize about religions, because now you have, we pass out an interpretation of this sermon, we pass out this sermon, we all do a reading of the sermon, we all come up with slightly different interpretations. And so at that point, then we're saying, well, what was the intent of the author? What was the context of the author? What was his audience? What were they trying to do with that? And so those are questions that which are great, which really, really, to me, help build that understanding that you can't essentialize religions.
Absolutely. Someone asked us that's I think a really great starting point, because, and what that does is that lets us overcome, people are asking about like the textbook version that can be very dismissive or kind of too essentialist, or has its own biases from the writers and anthropologists that are writing the textbook. And I think, again, when it comes to having students do the interpretation themselves, it creates a little bit of a barrier that allows for the conversation to happen, because it's now buffered by the text, as opposed to being mere opinion, yeah, or something that someone else has already interpreted for them. Yeah. And so it's no longer black and white, because it's not someone else's thoughts, it's your own. And it's no longer so personal, because it's buffered by the text. Yeah, and so again, go ahead, Tim.
No, you're interpreting the text, and that's your interpretation of the text, and definitely, there's a lot of give and take in that. And I think that whoever made the comment about biases in the textbook, I think that's another thing that can come up as well. Students can start analyzing, an essentialist approach to religious tradition in the textbook and compare it to the primary sources, which demonstrate that that's not actually how it looks, So yeah, that's an excellent question.
And so Dale is really active in the chat, and he's asking about primary sources being approached in the time frame in which they're written. So classical, like, religions are not necessarily the way that religion works today. Hinduism, Bhakti Yoga, the Vedic system, the caste system was dramatically changed by India's constitution. So as a world history person, we have a lot of US history people, so I'd love to talk about early American religious education and religious influences, but let's start with the world history, since that's something you're a specialist in. So talk about how you situate the discussion of religion within the kind of time frames.
I think that's a very difficult proposition. In world history, it's always an uphill battle between content and being able to cover everything that needs to be covered in that class. But I would say this, that's an example where you can take Hinduism, for example, and say, okay, give your students maybe 5 or 6 secondary sources of the description of the Hinduism, and have them start parsing that out and comparing those, and then going back and then taking a look at some primary sources of Hinduism as well, from maybe the 12th century to the 18th century to the 19th century, and see how that plays out. So there are a variety of ways that you can do it. What teachers have to be comfortable with, and which is very difficult at times, is that we don't need to be providing them the information. We want the students to uncover the information and present their findings to us, and us to help facilitate that dialogue.
Right, absolutely. And so we in our prep call, we were talking about, for either a non-religious educator or for a very religious educator, like, how would you help them support religious discussions in their classroom? So I want to get to that question, because it tees up nicely with a question in the chat, which is, from an Episcopal priest who's now a high school teacher, teaching at a public high school. And his question is like, do you ever see a time when a public high school teacher would open up about their own faith practice perspective? And I'm gonna just jump in there first as you gather your thoughts. I think the answer to that is you do it carefully if you do it at all. There's always, and I talk about this in a lot of my sessions, that there's always a tension between creating a space for students that's open and free. And that means that you reserve, as the authority in the room, you reserve your own opinion. And that's in tension with being a model of conviction, which is another civic virtue that's important. And anytime you're either one of those, there's a balance to what you're saying with the students and what space you're creating. My rule, just my own rule, was that I would be happy to talk with them about whatever they would like, but it would not be during class time. So they would have to come at lunch or after school, and it would only be after we were out of that unit, whatever the issue was, we were no longer discussing that thing. I think in my 10 years of teaching, maybe it happened twice, because I made it so that like it was open, they could if they wanted to, but it was never that important to them. Usually they were asking to try and distract something from happening as opposed to being authentically interested. But what are your thoughts on that about is there ever a time where you demonstrate your conviction about these sorts of things?
I think you have to, as a teacher, I think you're saying the exact same thing that you should say. You have to be very careful about making sure you understand where the notion of power is at. And what I'm saying is, if you sense the student's asking you because the student wants to know, because the student feels like in some way that will provide them some, benefit to know or ask you, then you need to be careful about that and not provide that information. Now, if they're just asking you, I saw you at the Catholic Church the other day, are you Catholic? I mean, at that point, I think yes, I'm Catholic, you got me. You can do that. I think that's acceptable. But I think, if they're asking you even further questions about, so what do you think about, some theological issues? I think that's where you need to put on the brakes. I think you don't really need to provide as much information, because at that point you don't know that if your position as having power is unduly influencing them, and for what reasons. And you got to be kind of careful on that process. So that's why I would say there's no easy answer to that one, though. So each teacher has their own perspective on that. So, but that's where I would be on that. But if you're talking about the classroom, I do think that there's some guidelines in a classroom that you need to follow through on, and these are well known, and definitely what we like to provide them. So, and this comes from a text which you can get freely online as well, from the First Amendment Center, is a Teacher's Guide to Religion in Public Schools. So these are 6 guidelines that if you're teaching, this is how you should approach religion. And so, first of all, teachers should always be academic and not devotional in their treatment of all religions. And I think most teachers understand this, but objectivity is the key to this perspective. And teachers should only teach for awareness of religions and not the acceptance of religion. We teach about religion, not for religion. So that's important. And teachers should only teach about religion and not want students to practice a religion. There have been some mistakes by teachers in the past who have, had students participate in religious ceremonies. That's not acceptable. And definitely you want students to be educated for the understanding of the diversity of religious views, and not impose a particular viewpoint. And that's where that question of, can you tell, let a student know, or if they're asking you, can you tell them about your religious perspective? That's where it gets a little gray, because you might not think you're imposing your viewpoint, but because you're a teacher and in a position of power, you might be imposing your viewpoint to some degree, and you need to be careful of that. And definitely teachers shouldn't promote or denigrate religions. I mean, for example, in the perpetrators of the horrors of 9/11, do not characterize the 1.8 billion other people who are Muslim in the world today, and people need to be aware of that. And then finally, we should only inform people of beliefs, and we don't need to make students believe any particular belief. And so those aren't my guidelines. Those are guidelines that have been set together by the Teacher's Guide to Religion in Public School by the First Amendment Center. Charles Haynes led that up. I mean, these are well known and need to be followed.
We've actually put that in the chat here for you, so you can grab that at will. Dr. Hall is just such a wealth of resources. We're trying to capture them as we go and make sure you have them available. And so we have a couple of comments, and I think that I can string a few of them together. And that's about confidence level. What are some of your strategies for kind of newer teachers or teachers who are newer to a district who just don't know that much about religion, how to have these conversations? I mean, first is, self-educate, but what other strategies do you have for having these kinds of conversations when, there's a tenuousness to the community that you're in? What are some strategies that you know?
Well, and so first of all, I'll have to say that I definitely want to self-educate, and I for years I read a variety of textbooks on religion, and for some reason I don't know if it's because of the static nature of the textbooks. I'm really pretty good at reading and grasping information and getting it, but it never seemed to come alive for me. But I'll have to say this, there's a free program on edX called World Religions Through Its Scriptures. And it features 6 of the major religious traditions. And it's free. I mean, you can pay if you want to have the verified certificate or whatever, but it is a wonderful program on really getting teachers to understand the complexity of all these religions. And it does use that cultural studies approach, which I talked about, which, talks about internal diversity, change over time, and the embeddedness of religions. So that's where I would suggest you would go, because honestly, it really does look at each major traditions, religious scriptures, talks about the variety of interpretations. You get a better sense of the religion, a lived religion there. So that's one place I would start.
That's awesome, and we've linked to that for you. That series is already there. Chris is on it, my colleague Chris, with making sure that we capture all of these chats, all of these resources. So here we have a kind of unique question that's really specific, but I think it illustrates the kind of knowing there's this concept called pedagogy of place, which means that you think about the physical location as being part of your teaching environment, right? And so when you're talking about a particular issue, you try and tie it to what was happening in your county or your town, and that helps situate your students kind of geographically. There's a similar thing that can be done, my understanding, Tim, is really understanding the culture you're embedded in and helping situate the religious conversation within that community. So there's a question that came out that says that there's a teacher who's on the US-Mexico border, who the students refuse to call Catholics Christian, like to put Catholics within the category of Christian, because they see Christian as the fundamentalist evangelical expression that demonizes Catholicism. So what are your thoughts on, or do you have any suggestions for how to kind of understand the culture, the religious culture in which your students are embedded, and support that?
Wow, and I do know this. There are other similar situations like that as well with the student body, and I think you do have to understand your student body and where they're coming from as you're approaching the classroom. What I would suggest is is that you go back to that cultural studies model that I spoke about, not only, with Catholicism, which that might be a good place to start out with, because you could definitely show the diversity within Catholicism, but then within the evangelical Christian groups as well, and show the diversity of belief and doctrine within that own tradition as well. And I think at that point, I think students would start to realize to demonize another group would be very difficult to do, because they're essentializing that group, and to essentialize Catholics is kind of difficult. I mean, even now, I think the Southern Baptist Convention is going through some moments of growing pains over a few ideas, I think with critical race theory as well. And there's been some splits with, I think, Beth Moore and another fellow as well, who have split from the Southern Baptist Convention. And that demonstrates a lot of that internal diversity within religious traditions. So I would start there as, kind of bring out those primary sources, allow students to start analyzing those primary sources, and maybe even with the evangelical tradition, and then start, seeing that internal diversity within the evangelical tradition that they seem to be very strongly held to.
And you see this especially in communities where you have large, ethnic groups or religious groups from immigrant families or transitional families. There's a chat going on about a classroom in Pennsylvania that was a bunch of Salvadorian kids, and there's some tension that he couldn't even follow because it was all in Spanish. And so it's understanding the culture you're embedded in goes a long way to helping have these conversations.
Yeah, I think so. And making sure that, I think something that you have to set up in the classroom beyond the, understanding the internal diversity is really making sure that your students, you create a safe environment for your students, and make sure that they feel comfortable and respected to speak freely. And notice that safe environment doesn't mean that all students have to agree with everything that's being stated. It just means that they're going to listen and disagree appropriately. And that's important, and having them develop that skills is important. I do think that, approaching it from a cultural studies approach, I think the students would stop essentializing groups. But before that happens, you definitely want to create that safe environment and create that classroom where they can have those disagreements, but be able to do so safely and disagree appropriately.
As we're coming to the end of our conversation, there is one more question that I have, and I was curious if it would come up. But when discussing the American founding in our pluralistic, diverse communities, what is your approach to the Judeo-tradition, the establishment of the Judeo-tradition in this kind of pluralist community that we now live in? How do we help students of all religions feel a part of that conversation?
Well, I think to some degree, I think we need to be going back to the sources, going back to the people that were influential on the founding. I think we need to be honest and really analyze what's going on, which it's from the sources that you can see many of those men were influenced by a variety of Christian traditions. And because of that, that influenced their perspectives on government and constitutions. And so making sure that we understand that there is that Christian theological influence. You can't, come on, we can't understand the American Revolution if we don't understand that the, Great Awakening happened, which really kind of, started to question, church authority, which really allowed the founding fathers to start to question governmental authority. So there's a lot of that going on. What we need our students to understand is that doesn't mean that our nation today is that nation. It's a nation that's changed over time, and things have happened. And there are different influences on our Constitution. It's a living and breathing document, and things have changed. The government has changed, and there are more there are more diverse influences today.
Again, that idea of this living religion, right? That it's not static, that it changes over time, and that's a feature, not a bug, right? Like, I love that phrase, that like, that it's part of the essential nature of communities, that they change to and they adapt and they evolve. And you know, the arm of justice is long, or the arm of history is long, but it bends towards justice, is what we're all trying to move towards, to a more just, freer, plural society. And a big part of that conversation is helping us have better conversations about religion across our communities, but especially in our classrooms. So unless there are any final questions from our audience, I want to just thank Dr. Hall so much. This was a fascinating conversation. You are such a wealth of resources. If you want to reach out to Dr. Hall, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you? You have your blog, you're active on Twitter. What's your Twitter handle?
Yeah, Twitter handle is probably the better way, is @ReligionMatter5, which is supposed to translate into Religion Matters, but it's @ReligionMatter5. And follow me on Twitter. I publish stuff out probably about twice a week on different, a lot of K-12 classroom resources on religion in the classroom. So definitely follow me and follow my blog.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. Again, this is such an important topic and you're such a wealth of resources. So I hope our listeners and viewers reach out to you. Again, my name is Rachel Davison Humphries. This was Civic Conversations Summer Series on race, religion, and politics. Check out our past video with Dr. Anika Prather discussing race in the classroom, and pay attention, look out on social media for our upcoming conversation on teaching politics. Thank you so much for the work you do in the classroom, for your commitment to your students and our civic project. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing from you. Talk to you soon.
All right, thank you.